My daughter started dating a strange man, until one day my 6-year-old grandson came to visit me and told me, "Mom asked me not to tell you what he does at home." When I insisted for him to tell me the truth, I was shocked by what I heard. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought a 6-year-old's whispered words could shatter everything I believed about my daughter's happiness. But that Tuesday afternoon in March, when little Tommy climbed onto my lap with tears in his eyes, I realized that sometimes the most devastating truths come from the most innocent mouths. Tommy had been staying with me for the afternoon while Eliana ran errands. At 65, these moments with my grandson had become the brightest part of my week. We'd spent the morning building a fort out of couch cushions and eating way too many chocolate chip cookies. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I noticed him getting quieter as the afternoon wore on. He was sitting on the floor, pushing his toy cars around without his usual enthusiasm. His little shoulders were hunched, and he kept glancing toward the window as if he was watching for something. Or someone. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked, settling down on the floor beside him. "You look worried about something." Tommy looked up at me with those big brown eyes that reminded me so much of Eliana when she was his age. For a moment, he seemed to be wrestling with something inside his head. Then he scooted closer to me, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Grandpa, can I tell you a secret? But you can't tell Mommy I told you, okay?" A cold feeling settled in my stomach. In my experience, when children ask you to keep secrets about their home life, it's rarely good news. I chose my words carefully. "Tommy, you know you can tell Grandpa anything. What's on your mind?" He glanced toward the window again, then back at me. "Mommy told me not to tell you about the things Brandon does at home. She said it would make you sad, and maybe you wouldn't want to see us anymore." My heart started pounding. Brandon had been dating my daughter for 8 months now, and while I'd never particularly warmed to the man, I'd tried to stay supportive for Eliana's sake. She seemed happy, or at least that's what I'd convinced myself to believe. "What kinds of things, Tommy?" The little boy's face scrunched up like he was trying to remember something complicated. "Well, sometimes Brandon uses loud words, really loud, and Mommy gets that look on her face like when I break something important, she gets all small and quiet." "Loud words?" I kept my voice gentle, even though my pulse was racing. "Yeah, like the words that make Mommy cover my ears when we hear them on TV, but Brandon says them right at Mommy, and then she cries when she thinks I'm not looking, but I see her in the kitchen sometimes, wiping her face with the dish towel." The image of my strong, independent daughter crying alone in her kitchen while her boyfriend berated her made my chest tighten with a rage I hadn't felt in years, but I forced myself to stay calm for Tommy's sake. "Does Brandon ever say these loud words to you?" Tommy shook his head quickly. "No, but he looks at me funny sometimes. Like when I want to hug Mommy and she's cooking dinner, he'll stand there and watch us with this face." Tommy demonstrated by narrowing his eyes and frowning deeply, and then Mommy lets go really fast and tells me to go play in my room. I felt sick. This innocent child was describing what sounded like a textbook case of emotional abuse, and I'd been completely oblivious. How had I missed this? When was the last time I'd really looked at Eliana, really paid attention to the subtle changes in her behavior? "Tommy, when Brandon uses those loud words, what does he say?" The boy fidgeted with his toy car, rolling it back and forth between his hands. "He says Mommy is stupid sometimes, and that she doesn't know how to do things right. Last week he got really mad because she bought the wrong kind of bread at the store. He kept saying it over and over, that she can't even do simple things without messing up." My hands clenched into fists without my permission. The thought of anyone speaking to my daughter that way, let alone someone who was supposed to love her, made me want to drive straight to her house and have a very direct conversation with Brandon. "And yesterday," Tommy continued, his voice getting even smaller, "Brandon told Mommy that maybe you didn't need to see me so much anymore. He said grandfathers sometimes get in the way of families, and that maybe it was time for Mommy to start depending on him instead of running to you all the time." That last revelation hit me like a physical blow. So Brandon was already working to isolate Eliana from her support system. It was a classic tactic, and I was ashamed that I hadn't recognized it sooner. "What did Mommy say when Brandon said that?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears. She didn't say anything. She just looked really sad and nodded. But then later, when Brandon went to take a shower, she hugged me really tight and told me she loved me. She said no matter what happens, I should always remember that Grandpa loves me too and that families stick together. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Eliana's car pulling into my driveway. Tommy immediately jumped up and ran to the window, his whole demeanor changing in an instant. The carefree child who'd been building forts with me that morning was gone, replaced by a little boy who suddenly seemed much older than his 6 years. "Remember, Grandpa," he whispered urgently, "you can't tell Mommy we talked about this. She'll get in trouble with Brandon if he finds out." As I watched my daughter walk up the front steps, I tried to see her through new eyes. Her smile seemed forced, and there were dark circles under her eyes that I'd attributed to the normal tiredness of single motherhood. But now I wondered what else I'd been missing. When Eliana knocked and entered, Tommy ran to her with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that spoke of relief rather than simple excitement. She hugged him tightly, maybe a little too tightly, and when she looked up at me over his head, I saw something in her eyes that I'd been too blind to notice before. Fear. Not fear of me, but a general wariness that seemed to have settled into her bones. This wasn't my confident, spirited daughter. This was a woman who was walking on eggshells, and I'd been too caught up in my own assumptions to see it. As she gathered Tommy's things and prepared to leave, I found myself studying every detail of her appearance, every gesture, every word, the way she kept checking her phone, the way she hurried through our goodbye, the way she avoided making direct eye contact for more than a few seconds at a time. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the couch cushions still scattered from our fort-building session. Tommy's words echoed in my head, each revelation more disturbing than the last. My daughter was in trouble, and I'd been completely unaware. But now I knew, and everything was about to change. The sleepless night started immediately after Tommy's revelation. I'd lie in bed replaying every interaction I'd had with Eliana over the past 8 months, searching for signs I'd missed. They were all there, glaring at me in hindsight like neon warning signs I'd somehow managed to ignore. The canceled Sunday dinners, the way she'd stopped calling me just to chat, how she'd become increasingly apologetic about everything, even things that didn't require an apology. The gradual disappearance of her infectious laugh. I'd attributed it all to the natural progression of a woman in a new relationship. But now I realized I'd been watching my daughter slowly disappear. 3 days after Tommy's visit, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had about respecting my adult daughter's privacy. I was going to watch, not spy, I told myself, just observe, pay attention in a way I should have been doing all along. I started small. I called Eliana on Thursday morning, something I used to do regularly but had stopped when her responses became increasingly brief and distracted. "Hi, Dad," she answered on the 4th ring, and I could immediately hear the strain in her voice. "Hey, sweetheart, I was just thinking about you and thought I'd check in. How are things going?" There was a pause, and I heard what sounded like a door closing softly. "Things are good, just busy. You know how it is." "Is Brandon around? I'd love to say hello." Another pause, longer this time. "He's at work. Dad, can I call you back later? I'm right in the middle of something." The old me would have said, of course, and hung up without thinking twice. But this time, I paid attention to what wasn't being said. The rushed quality of her voice, the way she'd moved to another room before really talking to me, the fact that she was whispering despite claiming Brandon wasn't home. "Of course, honey. Take your time. I love you. Love you too, Dad." After she hung up, I realized she'd never called me back later. She'd never called back anymore. That weekend, I decided to test something. I drove to Eliana's house Saturday afternoon, something I'd done countless times before Brandon entered the picture. I told myself I was just dropping by to see if Tommy wanted to throw a baseball around in the backyard. Brandon's truck was in the driveway, and through the living room window, I could see him on the couch watching television. I knocked on the front door and waited, hearing movement inside but no immediate answer. Finally, after what felt like a full minute, Eliana opened the door. She looked startled to see me, and not in a good way. "Dad, I wasn't expecting you. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd see if Tommy wanted to play catch. Is this a bad time?" I watched her glance nervously back toward the living room, where I could see Brandon's silhouette hadn't moved from the couch. He had to have heard me knock, had to have heard our conversation, but he made no move to acknowledge my presence. "Actually, Tommy's napping right now," Eliana said, though I could hear the sound of video games coming from upstairs. "Maybe next time? If you call first?" The request for advance notice stung, but not as much as the obvious lie about Tommy napping. I could see her fidgeting with the hem of her shirt, and when she moved slightly, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a bruise on her upper arm. When she noticed me looking, she quickly crossed her arms over her chest. "Of course," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Tell Tommy I stopped by?" "I will." As I walked back to my car, I made a mental note of everything I'd observed. Brandon's deliberate rudeness in not acknowledging me, Eliana's obvious nervousness and lies, the possible bruise, the way she'd positioned herself to block my view into the house. But the most telling detail came as I reached my car. I glanced back at the house and saw Brandon standing at the window, watching me leave. When our eyes met, his expression was cold and calculating. He didn't wave or nod. He just stared until I drove away. The following Tuesday, I tried a different approach. I called Eliana and invited her and Tommy to lunch, just the three of us. I half expected her to decline, but to my surprise, she agreed. "Brandon's working anyway," she said, and I caught something in her tone that suggested she was looking forward to the break. When they arrived at the restaurant, I was shocked by how much weight Eliana had lost. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, and there were hollows under her cheekbones that hadn't been there a few months ago. Tommy seemed subdued too, not his usual chatty self. Throughout lunch, I watched Eliana check her phone obsessively. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the screen, and each time she did, her shoulders would tense slightly. "Expecting an important call?" I asked. "Brandon likes to know where we are," she said, as if this was perfectly normal. "He worries when we're out." "Worries about what?" She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Just worries. He cares about us." But her phone buzzed again, and when she read the message, her face went pale. Her hands actually shook as she typed back a response. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she said quickly, but her voice had taken on that strained quality I was becoming familiar with. "We should probably head home soon, though. Brandon gets off work early today." We'd only been at the restaurant for 45 minutes, and our food had just arrived. Tommy had barely touched his grilled cheese, but Eliana was already reaching for her purse. "Can't Brandon wait a few minutes for his family to finish lunch?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped. I saw a flash of something desperate in her eyes, something that looked like a plea for help. But then she recovered, forcing that fake smile back into place. "He's just protective. It's sweet, really." But nothing about the situation felt sweet. As we hurried through the rest of our meal, I noticed how Eliana kept glancing toward the parking lot, as if she expected Brandon to appear at any moment. When her phone buzzed again, she actually flinched. The drive back to her house was tense. Tommy fell asleep in his car seat, and Eliana spent the entire ride staring out the window, lost in thought. When we pulled into her driveway, Brandon's truck was already there. "Thanks for lunch, Dad," she said, but she was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eager to get inside. "Eliana," I said, and something in my tone made her pause. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? If you ever need help with anything at all." For a moment, I thought she might break down right there in my car. Her lower lip trembled, and she looked like she was fighting back tears. But then she glanced toward the house, where I could see a figure watching us from the living room window. "I'm fine, Dad. Really, I'm happy." But as she gathered Tommy and hurried toward the front door, I noticed she never once looked back at me. And when the door closed behind them, I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple locks being engaged. I sat in my car for several more minutes, processing what I'd witnessed, the constant phone monitoring, Eliana's obvious fear and weight loss, the way she'd rushed home as if she were late for an appointment with judgment itself. My daughter wasn't just in a controlling relationship, she was trapped in one. And from what I'd observed, Brandon's control was becoming more complete with each passing day. As I drove home, I realized that my careful observation period was over. I'd seen enough to know that Tommy's innocent revelations were just the tip of the iceberg. Now the question was what I was going to do about it and how I could help Eliana without making her situation worse. Because one thing had become crystal clear. My daughter was in danger, and she was too scared or too isolated to ask for help. I spent 3 weeks building up the courage to have a direct conversation with Eliana about what I'd been observing. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, of rehearsing different approaches, of trying to figure out how to express my concerns without sounding like an overprotective father who couldn't accept his daughter's choices. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening when Eliana called to ask if I could watch Tommy for a few hours the next day. Brandon had a work meeting that was running late, and she needed to go to a doctor's appointment. Of course, I said immediately. Is everything okay? Are you feeling all right? Just a routine checkup, she said, but there was something evasive in her tone. Nothing to worry about. When she dropped Tommy off the next afternoon, I could see immediately that something was wrong. She moved carefully, like someone who was sore, and when she hugged me goodbye, I felt her wince slightly. Eliana, I said, catching her arm gently, as she started to leave. Are you sure you're okay? You seem to be in pain. Hey. She pulled away quickly, too quickly. I'm fine, Dad. Just pulled a muscle at the gym yesterday. But Eliana hadn't been to a gym in months. I knew because I'd been paying attention now, and she'd stopped doing all the activities she used to enjoy. No more yoga classes, no more weekend hikes, no more girls' nights with her college friends. After she left, I tried to focus on Tommy, but the little boy seemed even more withdrawn than usual. We played with his action figures for a while, but his heart wasn't in it. Finally, he looked up at me with those serious eyes that seemed too old for his face. Grandpa, why does Mommy go to the doctor so much now? My stomach dropped. What do you mean, buddy? She's been to the doctor 3 times since my birthday, but she always tells me it's nothing. And then she comes home and takes those pills that make her sleepy. Tommy's birthday had been 6 weeks ago. 3 doctor visits in 6 weeks, and Eliana hadn't mentioned any of them to me. I tried to keep my voice casual. Did she say what the doctors were helping her with? Tommy shrugged. She said she was clumsy and kept hurting herself. But Brandon always laughs when she says that. He says some people are just accident-prone. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed made me feel sick. Frequent doctor visits, pain medication, injuries that Brandon found amusing. My daughter was being hurt repeatedly, and she was covering for her abuser. When Eliana returned 3 hours later, I was ready for the conversation I'd been dreading. Tommy ran to her with his usual desperate enthusiasm, and I watched her carefully as she hugged him. She definitely favored her left side, and when Tommy bumped against her ribs, she couldn't quite hide a gasp of pain. Tommy, why don't you go upstairs and play in Grandpa's office for a few minutes? I suggested. I need to talk to your mom about something. The little boy looked between us with worried eyes, but he obediently headed upstairs. Once he was out of earshot, I turned to face my daughter. Eliana, we need to talk, really talk. She immediately tensed. Dad, if this is about Brandon again, it's about you, I interrupted. It's about the fact that you've lost 20 pounds in the past few months. It's about the way you check your phone every 30 seconds when you're away from him. It's about the bruises I can see you trying to hide. Her face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. Tommy told me about the loud words, Eliana, about the way Brandon speaks to you, about how you cry in the kitchen when you think no one is looking. The effect of my words was immediate and heartbreaking. Eliana's carefully constructed facade crumbled, and for a moment I saw the scared, hurt woman she'd become. But then, just as quickly, the walls went back up. Tommy is 6 years old, Dad. He doesn't understand adult relationships. Sometimes couples argue. Sometimes voices get raised. That's normal. Is it normal for your boyfriend to leave bruises on your arm? Is it normal to need 3 doctor visits in 6 weeks for mysterious injuries? She wrapped her arms around herself protectively. I told you I've been clumsy lately. I'm under stress at work, and I haven't been sleeping well. People have accidents when they're tired. Eliana, please. I'm your father. I love you. If someone is hurting you, no one is hurting me." The sharpness in her voice was so unlike her that it stopped me cold. "Brandon loves me. He takes care of me and Tommy. He's the best thing that's happened to us in years. Then why are you so afraid of him?" The question hung in the air between us. I watched her struggle with it, watched her try to formulate a denial that we both knew would be a lie. Finally, she looked away. "I'm not afraid of him. I'm afraid of you." "What?" "I'm afraid you're going to keep pushing this until you ruin everything good in my life. I'm afraid you can't stand to see me happy with someone who isn't you." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "Eliana, that's not, isn't it?" Her voice was getting louder now, more desperate. "You've never liked Brandon. From the very first time I brought him around, you've been looking for reasons to criticize him. And now you're using my own son to gather ammunition against the man I love. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From being in love? From having a partner who wants to take care of me? From building a life that doesn't revolve around running to daddy every time something goes wrong?" Each word was designed to hurt, and they found their target. I could see the pain in her eyes even as she said them, could see that she didn't really believe what she was saying. But Brandon's voice was coming out of her mouth, his twisted logic wrapped in her desperate need to make this all my fault instead of facing the truth. "This isn't love, Eliana. Love doesn't leave bruises. Love doesn't isolate you from your family. Brandon hasn't isolated me from anyone. I make my own choices about who I spend time with and how often. And lately, I choose to spend less time around people who can't respect my decisions." The conversation was spiraling exactly where I'd feared it would go. Every word I said was being twisted into evidence that I was the problem, that I was the one trying to control her life. Brandon had trained her well. "What about Tommy?" I asked desperately. "What about what this is doing to him?" "Tommy is fine. He's happy. He has a father figure now, something he's never had before. Brandon is teaching him to be strong, to be independent. Tommy is 6 years old, Eliana. He shouldn't have to be strong and independent. He should be allowed to be a child. And he is. But he's also learning that families stick together, that loyalty matters. Something I'm not sure you understand anymore." I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised, this person I thought I knew better than anyone in the world. The words coming out of her mouth were so foreign, so completely unlike her, that it was like talking to a stranger, wearing Eliana's face. "I love you," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I will always love you. And when you're ready to admit that something is wrong, I'll be here." She gathered Tommy and left without another word. I stood in my doorway watching their car disappear down the street, feeling more helpless than I'd ever felt in my life. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee I didn't want, staring at my phone. Every instinct I had screamed at me to call her, to apologize, to do whatever it took to maintain some connection with my daughter and grandson. But I knew that's exactly what Brandon wanted. He wanted me to back down, to accept the new reality where he controlled access to my family. 3 days later, Eliana called to cancel Tommy's visit for the weekend. She had some excuse about plans they'd made, but her voice was flat and mechanical, like she was reading from a script. "Can we reschedule for next weekend?" I asked. "I'll have to check with Brandon. His schedule is pretty unpredictable right now." Brandon's schedule, not hers, not what worked for her or for Tommy. I bit back the response I wanted to give and simply said, "I understood." A week passed without any contact. Then 2 weeks. When I tried calling, Eliana's responses were brief and non-committal. She was fine. Tommy was fine. They were busy. She'd call me back soon, but she never did. I'd lost them. In trying to save my daughter, I'd pushed her further into Brandon's arms. He'd won this round, and now I was on the outside looking in, watching helplessly as the two people I loved most in the world disappeared behind a wall of silence and lies. But I wasn't giving up, not on Eliana and not on Tommy. Brandon might have won the battle, but the war was far from over. After 6 weeks of minimal contact with Eliana and Tommy, I realized I needed to change my approach entirely. The direct confrontation had backfired spectacularly, driving my daughter deeper into Brandon's web of control. If I was going to help her, I needed to be smarter about it. That's when I decided to do something I'd never imagined myself doing. I hired a private investigator. Harold Martinez had been recommended by my lawyer as someone discreet and thorough. When I met him at his small office downtown, I felt like I was betraying Eliana's privacy in the worst possible way. But Tommy's frightened face kept flashing in my mind, and I knew I had to try a different strategy. "I need to know who Brandon Hutchins really is," I told Harold, sliding a folder across his desk with the basic information I had. "My daughter is involved with him, and I have reason to believe he's dangerous." Harold was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every family horror story imaginable. He reviewed the information without judgment. "What specifically are you looking for, Mr. Collins?" "Everything. His employment history, his financial situation, any criminal background, and especially any previous relationships. I need to know if there's a pattern of behavior." "That's going to take some time and cost some money. Are you prepared for what we might find?" I thought about the bruises on Eliana's arm, about Tommy's fearful whispers, about my daughter's dramatic weight loss and constant anxiety. "I'm prepared." While Harold worked on his investigation, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Eliana without directly challenging her about Brandon. It was a delicate balance, and it required me to swallow my pride and bite my tongue more times than I could count. I started small. I sent her a text apologizing for pushing too hard during our last conversation. I told her I missed her and Tommy, and that I was willing to respect her boundaries if she'd let me back into their lives. Her response came 2 days later. "I miss you too, Dad. Maybe we can try again." The reunion was awkward. When they came for Sunday dinner 3 weeks after our fight, both Eliana and Tommy seemed nervous. Eliana kept checking her phone, and Tommy stayed close to her side instead of running around my house with his usual enthusiasm. Brandon didn't come with them, which I took as both a blessing and a warning sign. Eliana explained that he was working on a project that required weekend hours, but something in her tone suggested this wasn't entirely voluntary on her part. Throughout the visit, I practiced the hardest form of self-control I'd ever attempted. I didn't comment on Eliana's continued weight loss. I didn't ask about the new cut on her lip that she'd tried to cover with makeup. I didn't mention the way Tommy flinched when I raised my voice to call him in from the backyard. Instead, I focused on being the supportive father and grandfather they needed me to be. I cooked Eliana's favorite meal. I listened when she talked about her job without offering unsolicited advice. I played quietly with Tommy and didn't push him to talk about his home life. The breakthrough came when Tommy spilled juice on his shirt. Eliana's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. She jumped up in a panic, grabbing napkins and apologizing profusely as if the small accident was somehow a catastrophe. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said gently. "Accidents happen. I'll get him one of my old t-shirts." But Eliana was already pulling out her phone, her hands shaking as she typed a message. "I have to tell Brandon. He'll want to know why Tommy's clothes are dirty." The fact that she felt compelled to report a 6-year-old's minor juice spill to her boyfriend told me everything I needed to know about the level of control Brandon exercised over their daily lives. But instead of pointing this out, I simply handed Tommy a clean shirt and suggested we all have dessert outside on the patio. By the end of the visit, some of the tension had eased. Eliana even laughed at one of my terrible dad jokes, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in months. When they left, she hugged me tightly. "Thanks for being patient with me, Dad. I know I haven't been easy to deal with lately. You never have to apologize for anything with me," I told her. "I love you no matter what." As their car pulled away, I felt like I'd taken the first small step toward getting my family back. But I also knew this was just the beginning of a very long process. 2 weeks later, Harold called with his preliminary findings. What he told me made my blood run cold. "Brandon Hutchins has quite a history," he said, his voice grave. 3 previous long-term relationships, all of which ended badly. 2 restraining orders. 1 dropped when the woman moved out of state. He's been arrested twice for domestic disturbance calls, but both times the charges were dropped when the women refused to press charges. What about his employment? He's worked at 6 different companies in the past 4 years, left most of them under questionable circumstances. Currently employed at Morrison Construction, but his supervisor there describes him as having anger management issues and being difficult to work with. Harold continued reading from his notes. The most disturbing thing I found was court records from his last serious relationship. The woman, Jennifer Walsh, filed for a protective order in February 2022. Her affidavit describes escalating verbal and physical abuse, financial control, and isolation from family and friends. My hands clenched as I listened. What happened to the case? She dropped it 3 weeks later, but I managed to track her down. She's living in Oregon now, remarried. She was willing to talk to me. What did she say? Harold paused. She said Brandon was the most dangerous man she'd ever met because he was so good at making his victims believe they deserved what was happening to them. She said he had a specific pattern. He'd start with small criticisms, then gradually escalate to financial control, isolation, and eventually physical violence. By the time the women realized what was happening, they were so isolated and beaten down that they felt like they had nowhere to go. Did she have any advice? She said the only reason she got out was because her sister literally kidnapped her one day and drove her to a women's shelter 5 states away. She said direct confrontation never worked because Brandon was too smart and too manipulative. He always found a way to turn the situation around and make her feel like she was the problem. Everything Jennifer had described matched perfectly with what I was seeing in Eliana's situation. The isolation, the weight loss, the constant anxiety, the way she'd turned my concerns back on me during our confrontation. There's one more thing, Harold said. Jennifer mentioned that Brandon had a particular hatred for father figures. He saw them as competition for control over his partners. She said he worked especially hard to turn women against their fathers because he viewed paternal relationships as the biggest threat to his dominance. After I hung up with Harold, I sat in my study for a long time, processing what I'd learned. Brandon wasn't just an abusive boyfriend. He was a predator with a clear pattern of behavior, and my daughter and grandson were his latest victims. But now, I had something I hadn't had before: information. I knew his history, his tactics, and his weaknesses. More importantly, I had proof that this wasn't Eliana's fault, and that there were other women who'd been exactly where she was now. I also had Jennifer's contact information. Harold had gotten her permission to share it with me if I thought it might help. The question was whether Eliana would be willing to hear from another woman who'd escaped Brandon's control, or if such contact would drive her further away. As I sat there planning my next move, one thing became crystal clear. I couldn't do this alone. Brandon was too skilled at manipulation, too experienced at turning people against each other. If I was going to save my family, I needed allies. I picked up my phone and started making calls. First to my sister Margaret, who'd always been close to Eliana, then to Eliana's best friend from college, Sarah, who'd mysteriously stopped coming around after Brandon entered the picture. Finally, to my neighbor Jim, who'd mentioned seeing Brandon's truck in Eliana's driveway at odd hours and had expressed concern about some shouting he'd heard. It was time to build a network of people who cared about Eliana and Tommy, people who could serve as witnesses, support systems, and reality checks when Brandon tried to gaslight his way out of the corner I was planning to back him into. The direct approach had failed, but I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. And this time, I wasn't going into battle alone. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came 3 weeks later, in the most unexpected way possible. Eliana called me on a Friday afternoon, her voice tight with stress, asking if I could help her host Tommy's 7th birthday party that weekend. Brandon was supposed to help, she explained, but he has to work. The supervisor is making him pull overtime on Saturday. I knew from Harold's investigation that Brandon's job situation was actually much more precarious than Eliana realized. His supervisor had described him as unreliable and confrontational, but I kept that information to myself. Of course I'll help, I said immediately. What do you need me to do? Could you maybe invite some of the family, Margaret and her kids, maybe? Tommy keeps asking about his cousins, and I thought having more people around might make it feel more special. This was exactly the opening I'd been hoping for. A chance to have multiple family members witness Brandon's behavior in a social setting where he couldn't control every variable. Absolutely. I'll call Margaret right now. What about Sarah? I know Tommy always loved when Aunt Sarah came to his parties. There was a long pause. I don't think Sarah can make it. She's been really busy with work lately. I knew that wasn't true. I'd already spoken to Sarah, who told me that Eliana had been avoiding her calls for months. But I didn't push. Instead, I simply said I'd make some calls and see who was available. By Saturday morning, I'd assembled a small but strategic group, Margaret and her 2 teenagers, my neighbor Jim and his wife Carol, who'd known Eliana since she was Tommy's age, even my brother Robert, who lived 2 hours away, but had always been fond of his niece. The party was supposed to start at 2 in the afternoon. I arrived early to help set up, and I was immediately struck by how nervous Eliana seemed. She kept checking the time and glancing toward the window, as if she was expecting trouble. Brandon said he'd try to make it by 3, she told me, as we hung streamers in the backyard. His supervisor is really demanding lately. Sometimes these work emergencies can't be avoided. I nodded sympathetically, but I was actually hoping Brandon would show up. Everything I'd planned depended on him being there to reveal his true nature in front of witnesses. The guests started arriving around 2:15. Tommy was genuinely excited to see his cousins and the other adults who'd been absent from his life for so long. For the first hour, it felt like old times. Eliana relaxed slightly, laughing at her brother Robert's terrible magic tricks and helping the kids organize games in the backyard. But I could see her checking her phone constantly, and her anxiety increased noticeably as 3 o'clock approached and passed without any sign of Brandon. At 3:30, his truck pulled into the driveway with an aggressive screech of brakes that made everyone in the backyard turn toward the sound. I watched Eliana's face go pale as Brandon slammed the truck door and stalked toward the backyard gate. Even from a distance, I could tell he was in a foul mood. His jaw was clenched, his movements sharp and aggressive. When he entered the backyard, he barely acknowledged the other guests, instead making a beeline straight for Eliana. "We need to talk," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Now, Brandon, we're in the middle of Tommy's party," Eliana said softly, glancing nervously at our family members. "Can it wait?" "No, it can't wait. Do you have any idea what kind of day I've had, and I come home to find you throwing some party without even asking me?" The backyard had gone quiet. The kids continued playing, but all the adults were watching this interaction with growing concern. Margaret caught my eye, her expression worried. "I told you about the party," Eliana said, her voice getting smaller. "We talked about it on Wednesday. You mentioned something about cake for the kid. You didn't say anything about turning our house into a circus with all these people." The contempt in his voice when he said, "all these people," was unmistakable. He was looking directly at me when he said it, making it clear that my presence was particularly unwelcome. "Brandon, please," Eliana whispered. "It's Tommy's birthday. And whose fault is it that I'm missing it? Whose fault is it that I had to work overtime because my girlfriend can't manage her money properly and I have to pick up extra shifts to cover her bills?" I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was exactly what I'd hoped would happen. Brandon was revealing himself without any prompting from me. Margaret stepped forward. "Brandon, maybe you should take a minute to cool down. It's been a long day for everyone." The look he gave my sister was pure poison. "I don't need advice from strangers about how to handle my own family." "I'm hardly a stranger," Margaret replied coolly. "I'm Eliana's aunt, and Tommy's great-aunt." "You're people who don't live here and don't understand the situation," Brandon snapped back. "Eliana's always running to her family instead of dealing with problems like an adult." That's when Robert spoke up. At 6'3" and 220 pounds, my brother had always been protective of his niece. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable warning. "I think you need to adjust your tone, son. This is a child's birthday party." Brandon's face flushed red. "Don't call me son, and don't tell me how to talk to my girlfriend in my own house." "Actually," I said quietly, unable to stay silent any longer, "this is Eliana's house. She's the one on the lease." The moment I spoke, Brandon's attention focused on me like a laser. All the rage he'd been directing at the situation suddenly had a specific target. "There he is," Brandon said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The puppet master himself. I should have known you were behind this whole setup. I helped my daughter plan a birthday party for my grandson. That's what grandfathers do. What grandfathers do is mind their own business and let their adult children live their own lives. But you've never been able to do that, have you, Samuel? You've always had to be in control." The irony of Brandon accusing anyone else of being controlling wasn't lost on anyone present. I could see the shock on my family members' faces as they witnessed firsthand the kind of verbal abuse Eliana had been enduring. "All I've ever wanted is for my daughter and grandson to be happy and safe," I said evenly. "Safe?" Brandon let out a harsh laugh. "Safe from what? From having a man in their lives who actually takes care of them? From having someone who doesn't coddle them and make them weak?" "Brandon, please stop," Eliana said desperately. "You're scaring Tommy." I looked over at my grandson, who had indeed stopped playing and was watching the adult confrontation with wide, frightened eyes. Several of the other children had moved closer to their parents, sensing the tension in the air. "I'm not scaring anyone," Brandon said, but his voice had gotten even louder. "I'm just tired of pretending that this dysfunction is normal. I'm tired of watching your father undermine our relationship every chance he gets." "Nobody's undermining anything," Margaret said firmly. "We're just here to celebrate Tommy's birthday. You're here because Samuel called you. You're here because he's trying to turn Eliana's family against me. Well, guess what? I'm not going anywhere. Eliana and Tommy need me, whether you people like it or not." That's when Tommy surprised everyone. The little boy walked over to his mother and took her hand, looking up at Brandon with more courage than any 7-year-old should have to muster. "You're being mean to my mom," he said in a clear, steady voice, "and you're ruining my birthday party." The backyard went completely silent. Brandon stared down at Tommy with an expression of pure fury, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike the child. Instead, he turned that rage back on Eliana. "Great. Now you've got the kid talking back to me too. This is exactly what I'm talking about. No discipline, no respect, no boundaries." "He's 7 years old," Eliana said, and for the first time that day, there was a hint of strength in her voice. "He's defending his mother. He's being disrespectful to the man who's been taking care of him." "Taking care of him?" The words came out before I could stop them. "Is that what you call it when you make him keep secrets? When you tell him that grandfathers are bad for families?" Brandon's face went white with rage. "You turned my own stepson against me. You poisoned him with your lies." "I never had to say a word against you, Brandon. Tommy sees for himself how you treat his mother." That's when Brandon made the mistake I'd been waiting for. Instead of backing down or trying to defuse the situation, he completely lost control. "You want to know how I treat her?" he shouted, pointing at Eliana. "I treat her like a woman instead of a spoiled little girl who runs to daddy every time life gets complicated. I'm the one who pays the bills when she comes up short. I'm the one who keeps this family together. By criticizing everything she does, by monitoring her phone calls, by making her account for every minute she spends away from you, by being a man, by taking responsibility, by not letting her drift through life without any consequences for her actions." Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "Is that what you call the bruises on her arms? Consequences?" The accusation hung in the air like a bomb. Everyone was staring at Brandon, waiting for his response. For a moment, he seemed to realize he'd gone too far, that he'd revealed too much in front of too many people. But instead of trying to backtrack, he doubled down. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. Sometimes words aren't enough to get through to someone who refuses to listen. The admission was everything I'd hoped for, and more than I'd dared to expect. In front of multiple witnesses, Brandon had essentially confessed to physically abusing my daughter. Robert took a step toward Brandon, his voice deadly calm. "I think you should leave. Now. This is my house." "No," Eliana said suddenly, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in months. "This is my house, and I want you to leave." Brandon stared at her in shock. "Eliana, you don't mean that. You're just upset because your family is here stirring up trouble." "I mean it," she said, and I could see tears streaming down her face. "I want you to leave. I want you to pack your things and go." For a moment, Brandon looked like he might explode again, But then he seemed to realize that he was outnumbered, that every adult in that backyard was united against him. "Fine," he said, his voice venomous. "But don't come crying to me when reality hits. Don't come begging me to come back when you realize you can't handle life without me." He stormed toward the house, and we could hear him crashing around inside, presumably gathering his belongings. 20 minutes later, his truck roared out of the driveway for the last time. The backyard was quiet for a long moment after he left. Then Tommy walked over to Eliana and hugged her legs. "Is the bad man gone, Mommy?" Eliana picked up her son, holding him tight as she finally let herself cry. "Yes, baby, the bad man is gone." The first few days after Brandon's explosive departure were some of the most difficult my family had ever faced. Eliana was a wreck of conflicting emotions, relief mixed with fear, freedom tangled with shame. She'd spent so many months defending Brandon, convinced that everyone else was wrong about him, that facing the truth required her to acknowledge how badly she'd been manipulated. The night after the birthday party, she called me at 11:30, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you. I'm so sorry I put Tommy through this." I drove to her house immediately, finding her sitting on her front porch in her pajamas, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd seen her since she was a child. "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her, sitting down beside her on the steps. "Brandon is a professional manipulator. What happened to you could happen to anyone." "But the signs were all there, weren't they? Tommy tried to tell me. You tried to tell me." Even my own instincts were screaming at me, but I ignored everything. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, feeling how thin she'd become. "That's what abusers do, sweetheart. They make you doubt your own perceptions. They isolate you from the people who care about you. They convince you that you're the problem." I lost so much weight. I was so anxious all the time. I stopped seeing my friends, stopped doing things I enjoyed. How did I not realize what was happening? Because he made those changes gradually, because he convinced you that each restriction was for your own good, or because you'd done something to deserve it. That's how these people operate. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of her neighborhood. Finally, she spoke again. "I keep waiting for him to come back. I keep expecting him to show up and demand that I let him in. Part of me is terrified, but part of me still wants to apologize to him." How sick is that? It's not sick at all. It's normal. He conditioned you to believe that his anger was always your fault, that you were responsible for managing his emotions. It's going to take time to unlearn those responses. What if I can't? What if I'm too damaged now to have normal relationships? I turned to face her fully. "Eliana, you are one of the strongest people I know. You got out. You chose to protect yourself and Tommy, even when it was terrifying. That takes incredible courage. I didn't get out on my own, though. If you and the family hadn't been there today, if he hadn't lost control in front of witnesses, I might have gone right back to making excuses for him. But you didn't. When the moment came, when you had to choose between Brandon and your son's safety, you chose Tommy. You chose yourself. That's what matters." The next morning, I helped Eliana change the locks on her house. It was a practical necessity, but it was also symbolic. She was taking back control of her own space, her own life. Over the following weeks, I watched my daughter slowly come back to life. The process wasn't linear. There were bad days when she second-guessed her decision, when she worried that she'd made a mistake, when Brandon's voice echoed in her head, telling her she was worthless without him. But there were good days, too. Days when she laughed at Tommy's silly jokes, days when she called Sarah and tentatively began rebuilding that friendship. Days when she cooked dinner without checking her phone every few minutes, without worrying about whether someone would criticize her choices. Tommy's recovery was even more remarkable to witness. Within 2 weeks of Brandon's departure, he was back to his old self, chatty, curious, eager to play and explore. The fearful, watchful quality that had settled over him during the months with Brandon disappeared almost entirely. "Grandpa," he said one afternoon while we were building with blocks in my living room, "I'm glad the bad man is gone." Mommy smiles with her real smile now, out of the mouths of babes. 3 weeks after the birthday party confrontation, Eliana made a decision that surprised me. She wanted to talk to Jennifer Walsh, the woman from Oregon who'd escaped from Brandon before her. "I need to understand what happened to me," she explained. "I need to hear from someone who's been where I was." I contacted Harold, who reached out to Jennifer. She was more than willing to talk to Eliana, understanding the importance of connection between survivors. Their first phone conversation lasted 3 hours. When Eliana hung up, she looked emotionally drained, but somehow lighter. "She told me things about Brandon that I never told anyone," Eliana said. "Things he said to her, ways he manipulated her. It was like she was describing my own life. She helped me understand that none of it was my fault, that it wasn't about anything wrong with me. It was about his need to control." Jennifer became an ongoing source of support for Eliana, someone who understood the specific trauma of being involved with Brandon Hutchins. Through Jennifer, Eliana also connected with a support group for domestic abuse survivors, something that provided both practical guidance and emotional healing. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own guilt and regret about how long it had taken me to recognize what was happening. I'd always prided myself on being a protective father, but I'd been blind to my daughter's suffering for months. "You couldn't have known," Margaret told me one evening when I voiced these concerns. "He was skilled at hiding his true nature, and when you did figure it out, you acted. You saved them." I almost drove her away completely with that confrontation. If I'd pushed any harder, she might have cut me off entirely. "But you learned from that mistake. You found a better way. And when the opportunity came, you were ready." The opportunity she was referring to was the birthday party, but I knew my real success had been in the weeks leading up to that day. I'd rebuilt trust with Eliana by respecting her boundaries, by showing patience instead of judgment, by proving that my love was unconditional even when I disagreed with her choices. 2 months after Brandon left, Eliana started therapy. Not couples therapy, not family therapy, but individual counseling to help her process what had happened and learn to trust her own instincts again. "I want to understand how I got into that situation," she told me. "I want to make sure I never ignore red flags like that again." Her therapist was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in trauma recovery. Through their work together, Eliana began to understand the psychological tactics Brandon had used, and more importantly, she began to rebuild her sense of self-worth. Dr. Chen says that abusers specifically target people who are empathetic and giving, Eliana explained after one of her sessions. They look for people who will make excuses for bad behavior, who will try to fix problems instead of walking away from them. "That sounds like you," I said gently. "You've always been someone who sees the best in people, who gives second chances." But Dr. Chen says those aren't bad qualities. She says the goal isn't to become cynical or closed off. It's to learn to trust my gut feelings, to pay attention when someone's actions don't match their words. As autumn turned to winter, our family settled into new routines. Tommy spent more time with me, no longer worried about getting in trouble for enjoying his grandfather's company. Eliana reconnected with old friends and even started dating again, carefully, thoughtfully, with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. The legal aftermath of Brandon's abuse was minimal but satisfying. He'd violated his lease when he abandoned the apartment he'd been sharing with Eliana, and his employment with Morrison Construction had ended abruptly after several complaints about his behavior. Last I heard, he'd left town entirely, which suited everyone fine. More importantly, there were no attempts at reconciliation, no dramatic scenes where he tried to win Eliana back. Whether this was because he'd moved on to a new victim or because he recognized that he'd burned his bridges completely, I didn't know and didn't care. 6 months after that terrible birthday party, we had another celebration, a much quieter affair to mark Tommy starting 2nd grade. As I watched my grandson blow out his candles, surrounded by family members who loved him, I reflected on how much had changed. Eliana looked healthy again. She'd gained back most of the weight she'd lost. The dark circles under her eyes had disappeared, and most importantly, she carried herself with confidence instead of constant anxiety. She was making her own decisions again, managing her own finances, choosing how to spend her time without having to justify those choices to anyone. "Dad," she said to me as we cleaned up after the party, "I never properly thanked you for not giving up on us. I know there were times when it would have been easier to just accept that I'd made my choice and walk away. That was never an option," I told her. "You're my daughter. Tommy is my grandson. I would have kept fighting for you no matter how long it took. I know that now, but during those months with Brandon, I forgot. He made me believe that you were trying to control me, that your concern was really just jealousy or possessiveness. I'm sorry I believed that. You believed it because he was very good at manipulation. That's not your fault." She hugged me then, a real hug, without any tension or fear behind it. "I love you, Dad, and I'm so grateful Tommy still has his grandfather in his life." That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my living room looking at photos from both birthday parties, the one where Brandon had revealed his true nature, and this recent one where genuine joy and laughter filled every frame. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Tommy that had started this whole journey, about his innocent warning that something was wrong at home. That little boy had been braver than any of the adults in his life, speaking truth, even when he'd been told to keep secrets. Children see things clearly, I realized. They haven't learned yet to make excuses for bad behavior or to ignore their instincts in favor of social politeness. Tommy had known Brandon was dangerous long before I figured it out. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete peace about my family's future. Eliana and Tommy were safe, they were healing, and they were back in my life not as victims I had to rescue, but as strong, independent people who chose to include me in their world. The nightmare was over. The real family, the one built on love and respect rather than fear and control, was stronger than ever.